Which brings us to our second paper this afternoon. Professor Tim Fuller, who is Professor of Political Science at Colorado College, where he has taught political theory since 1965, having published many essays and edited books, including The Intellectual Legacy of Michael Oakeshott in 2005, Reassessing the Liberal State in 2001, and The Voice of Liberal Learning, Michael Oakeshott on Education in 2000. And then Machiavelli's Legacy, The Prince After 500 Years in 2015. In 2024, Professor Fuller published his collected essays on Michael Oakeshott on the Human Condition, essays by Timothy Fuller from the Liberty Fund. And last month, in May 2025, he hosted the biennial conference of the Michael Oakeshott Association at Colorado College. Today, Tim's paper is titled Freedom as the Ordeal of Consciousness, Reflections on Chantal Delsol, Michael Oakeshott, and Roger Scruton. Tim, thank you very much indeed. I think you're muted, Tim, by the way.
Thank you very much, John. I'm happy to say that we first encountered each other in 1979, a long time ago. And this essay is my current thinking on freedom as understood from a conservative perspective. The ordeal of consciousness is a phrase I borrow from Oakeshott to initiate this reflection on freedom and the conservative disposition expressed in various ways by Oakeshott, Scruton, and Delsol. The ordeal of consciousness identifies us as choice-making agents for whom freedom is the experience inevitably requiring choice among alternative possibilities, including efforts to escape the burdens of choice-making agency. The conservative disposition acknowledges the ordeal, seeking to manage it by negotiating between reliance on past experience and assessment of what altering circumstances appear to demand. Like St. Augustine, we experience the present moment as the intersection between recollecting the past and imagining the future. We are temporal creatures negotiating the ravages of change, yet able to imagine what is not time-bound, drawing us to encounter with the eternal. That we are subject to guilt about our past and anxiety about our imagined future inhibits enjoyment of present possibilities. The necessity to decide what to preserve or to alter in our situation is unavoidable. Those of conservative disposition acknowledge the situation while seeking to enjoy present possibilities so far as possible. The conservative disposition does not oppose change, since change is inevitable. Rather, it accepts the ambiguity of change and does not overrate its potential. Conditions may be improved, they cannot be perfected. Transition
I think we've lost Tim there.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Tim, yes. Actually, that's rather better. There was a very odd background noise. I wonder if your camera's gone off, would you mind not bringing it back just in case it's the camera, and we'll try and bring it back for the questions.
That's fine.
Thank you. We can hear you clearly.
All right. Roger Scruton has expressed this in his discussion of the uses of pessimism. Michael Oakeshott has expressed this in his invocation of the poetic moments that interrupt the dailiness of life. Chantal Delsol has spoken of the unlearned lessons of the 20th century that challenge the Enlightenment Project's confidence in continuous improvement. Freedom for the conservative disposition includes restraint of anxiety about the human condition and skepticism about schemes claiming to transcend its limits. It combines elements of the Stoic with an inherited Christian openness to the transtemporal. Scruton once described it as coming to terms with and not succumbing to the benign shabbiness of life. Freedom for the conservative also means resisting the dominance of politics in one's life. Oakeshott described himself as a skeptic who would do better if he knew how. He described the basic character of politics while remaining aloof from political engagement. He thought politics was a necessary evil, neither to be despised nor overrated. For him, to be free required resisting the claims of politics. He rejected the claims of politics to be the central activity of life. He knew that individual freedom required limited government, property rights, and the rule of law, and that the fundamental task of governing is to keep the ship of state afloat on a boundless and bottomless sea without a safe haven. He thought the quest for meaning must look to poetry, art, philosophy, religion. These, he thought, are the true sources of vitality and revitalization. Universities, Oakeshott argued, rightly understood, are places set aside for reflective pursuit of those sources of vitality. The study of politics for him meant examining politics philosophically and historically, not using the university to carry on politics by other means. He understood universities to be places for reflective examination of the human condition through conversation among diverse modes of investigation. Both in study and in the practical realm, the free person willingly subscribes to basic rules of order, which provide the background conditions safely to pursue one's own path. This way of thinking made his initial reception among American conservatives somewhat reserved. He was not a movement conservative. American conservatives like Irving Kristol could admire Oakeshott up to a point while expressing impatience with his aloofness from political action. Oakeshott left the practical uses of his ideas to those for whom politics is their central focus. William F. Buckley, on the other hand, who always sought to effect cooperation among differing conservative expressions, recognized Oakeshott's voice to be significant in the conservative conversation. Oakeshott offered a compelling critique of rationalism's distrust of tradition, but Russell Kirk thought his skepticism suggested an insufficient appreciation for tradition and religion. Oakeshott, by disposition, was closer to Hume than to Burke. And incidentally, I noticed that while Burke's name has been mentioned, Hume's has been neglected. And there's no doubt in my mind that Hume was more influential on Oakeshott's way of thinking. Because Oakeshott was not romantically attached to tradition, though he knew that respect for inheritance naturally limited illusory efforts to design an independent future. In his magnum opus on human conduct, he did not employ the word tradition, referring rather to practices. And this decision captured his reservation about traditionalists, perhaps Kirk, who defend tradition canonically in formal principles, thereby becoming contestants in a conflict of abstract ideals which they otherwise reject. Oakeshott also understood transcendence as the experience of unexpected, unplanned, transitory moments of delight in love and friendship, and he took encounters with eternity to be fleeting experiences of fulfillment within, but not beyond, our temporal lives. Scruton, who certainly endorsed enjoyment of present possibilities, invested far more in politics, combating authoritarian socialism and defending the West against the rest, in a manner consistent with Samuel Huntington's analysis of the clash of civilizations. He was a philosopher, but also a cultural historian and activist, writing on music and the arts, popular culture, the distinction between high culture and common culture, and so on. Scruton was also less libertarian than, by temperament at least, Oakeshott was. In Scruton's essay, Governing Rightly, he asserted that conservatives, quote, have failed to offer the electorate a believable blueprint for the true domain of government, precisely because they have failed to see that what they are advocating is not freedom from government, but rather another and better kind of government, a government that embodies all that we surrender to our neighbors when we join with them as a nation. One can see here an effort, perhaps reminiscent of Hegel, to reconcile what Oakeshott had described as the discordant concord between rival ideas of the modern state, civil association emphasizing individuality, and enterprise association signifying collective purpose. In America today, the counterclaims of individualism and collective identity are managed through an administrative bureaucratic regime. What has evolved is a confusing amalgamation of alternative concepts of association, reflected in the difficulty of establishing conservative positions on the task of governing, involving both distrust of government on one hand, while on the other hand, relying on government to effect reforms. Were Oakeshott still with us, he might revise his analysis of the dynamics of the modern state. He saw the modern state to be constituted in perennial tension between the ideals of civil and enterprise association. The clarity of the distinction is challenged in the technological bureaucratic society that increasingly dominates our time. Be that as it may, his critique of rationalism in politics, his description of political judgment as the pursuit of intimations, and the perennial insight of the Babel myth all remain relevant to defending freedom. His invocation of the voice of poetry and of conversation as the most human activities arm us against the deadliness of doing. The skeptical disposition, as Oakeshott saw, also resists the language of emergency or the proclamation of existential threat. The skeptical disposition's nemesis is reluctance to acknowledge actual emergencies when they occur. In this respect, Scruton modifies Oakeshott's skepticism, even as he finds virtue in pessimism. The view of these two eminent conservative thinkers taken together might express a sense of urgency without apocalypse. Scruton's defense of the West, his critique of the West's loss of nerve and increasing sense of guilt, may be seen as conversational responses to the disengagement of Oakeshott, a more activist response to the conditions Oakeshott's insights rightly identify. Chantal Delsol insists that we are living in late modernity. She rejects the idea that we have been moved into post-modernity, as asserted by the integralist Patrick Deneen that we are all postmodern now. She draws a parallel to late antiquity. By this, she means that there is a crisis of meaning in which we cling to the modern Enlightenment project of progressive advance, even though afflicted with disillusionment and doubt imposed by the derangements of the last 100 years, promoting speculation that we are entering a new dispensation. We are, so to speak, in an interim where the old ideas linger on with decreasing authority. She begins her book, Icarus Fallen, The Search for Meaning in an Uncertain World, asking us to imagine that Icarus has flown out of the labyrinth, lost his wings, fallen not into the sea, but back into the labyrinth and has survived. This introduces her diagnosis of our situation. We cling to the ideal of enlightenment and progress on a global scale, while actual historical experience contradicts the project, calling our faith in it into question, resulting in the crisis of late modernity. We seem unable to recover the historic faith in the heavenly kingdom, which has receded with the decline of Christendom. For those like her of a Catholic disposition, no political remedy is available to counter the reawakening of pagan practices, which she sees as inadequate diversions disguising the advance of nihilism. She witnesses to trans-temporal fulfillment as Christendom recedes. In the unlearned lessons of the 20th century, she says, quote, "Because the human fabric remains imperfect, it cannot be reinvented by the will or indefinitely molded by desire. The presence of evil prevents the future from creating its own order. It must respect a certain givenness of being which must always remain largely unknown. The constitutive incompleteness of man forbids him to attempt to return perfection into reality. In order to care for, improve, and clear the brush away from what exists, we must keep in check our will to begin again ex nihilo, loving both existence and those beings who exist. That is, we must love them more than the products of our own minds. The failures of the 20th century reveal who we are. We are not demiurges, we are gardeners." And she goes on to say, "We are so accustomed to cherishing only our ideas that we now seek lantern in hand those who are willing to love humanity in all its leaden heaviness, its terrible mediocrity, its ambiguous ways of life, its ill-adapted institutions, and its excesses. To escape from the ideological mindset would entail a shift of focus. We would have to stop seeing the individual solely in light of characteristics of his social, cultural, sexual, or behavioral group. The good does not apply to concepts, but to beings of flesh and blood." And Oakeshott, in his 1948 essay, The Tower of Babel, says this: "European morality, having once committed the indiscretion of formulating itself in the abstract terms of moral ideas, it was only to be expected that its critics, who have never for long been silent, should seize upon these, and that in defending them against attack, they should become rigid and exaggerated. This is an unhappy form of morality, prone to obsession and at war with itself, encouraged by almost all the intellectual tendencies of recent centuries, that it is not a misfortune, but a situation to be welcome." Delsol and Oakeshott provide insight into the inescapable polarization of our age. Freedom is constituted in understanding why things are the way they are. In acknowledging our situatedness, we also see beyond it. Such insight might encourage creative resignation, resisting abstract aspirations which set us up for repeated disillusion. And Scruton, in The Uses of Pessimism and the Danger of False Hope, concludes, "Rather than lose ourselves in these unreal hopes, therefore, we should reflect again on our nature as settled negotiating creatures and return to the task at hand, which is to look with irony and detachment on our actual situation and to study how to live at peace with what we find." And more darkly, Scruton says, "To those who wish for it, the ethical life may still be retrieved. Ours is a catacomb culture, a flame kept alive by undaunted monks." That's from his Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Politics. What these authors offer, I will call Christian Stoicism. This, I think, describes Delsol's witness to permanent truths no longer sustained by Christendom's declining authority, and the resignation in Oakeshott and Scruton, whose witness to what has been is marked by affectionate skepticism. It expresses the experience of freedom for conservatives in late modernity, living in consciousness of what has been and what might persist through troubled circumstances. Oakeshott expresses this eloquently. He says, "The general characteristics of this disposition are not difficult to discern. They center upon a propensity to use and to enjoy what is available rather than to wish for or to look for something else, to delight in what is present rather than what was or what may be, an appropriate gratefulness for what is available, and consequently the acknowledgement of a gift of an inheritance from the past. But there is no mere idolizing of what is past and gone. What is esteemed is the present, and it is esteemed not on account of its connections with a remote antiquity, nor because it is recognized to be more admirable than any possible alternative, but on account of its familiarity." And Scruton, in an essay called Eliot and Conservatism, says, "The conservative response to modernity is to embrace it, but to embrace it critically, in full consciousness that human achievements are rare and precarious, that we have no God-given right to destroy our inheritance, but must always submit to the voice of order and set an example of orderly living. The task is to rediscover the world which made us, to see ourselves as part of something greater, which depends upon us for its survival. Such is the conservative message for our times, and it is a message beyond politics, a message of liturgical weight and authority, but a message which must be received if humane and moderate politics is to remain a possibility." Now, so far, I have not spoken of tradition. And that's because I think we are at a point in late modernity when all accounts of a canonical tradition are challenged. Globalism, the technological imperative, and the pressure that every culture exerts on every other culture means that one cannot invoke tradition without confronting the challenge of proliferating alternatives. All three thinkers discussed here are nevertheless dispositionally traditionalist. Delsol, as a Catholic, subscribes to an apostolic faith understood as a truth to which she bears witness, transcending the uncertainties of and not dependent on contested traditionality. I call this Christian Stoicism. Oakeshott, in his historical account of the birth of the modern state, describes discernible historic practices involving contested interpretations and responses. His inclination to prefer some of those responses to others cannot overcome the strength of the alternatives. In fact, the stability of modern culture, insofar as it enjoys stability, is for him dependent on unresolved polarity, which I call affectionate skepticism. Scruton equally acknowledges the unresolved, deeply troubled character of modernity. He eloquently offers remembrance of things past with liturgical weight. I take this to mean dutiful service to the complex inheritance, the experience both of God's presence and absence in history. In short, they all acknowledge our historical situatedness, and they see beyond it. But there is no rest in an unchallenged vision. In this, they experience freedom as the ordeal of consciousness, seeking what may be enjoyed in the present moment, despite the pressures always to live in tension between past and future. That's it.
Tim, thank you very much indeed.